Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 191, November 11th to November 17th, 1864. Last week, we had continued action in the Petersburg area. There has not been a breakthrough yet, but we have continued the strategy of trying at the Confederate flanks, something that's going to keep occurring. We also talked about Forrest's Tennessee raid and Abraham Lincoln being reelected. Forrest taps into his legend a little more, and Lincoln gets to continue the war without a threat from peace Democrats, hopefully to its conclusion. This week, we will talk about one of the more famous events of the war. If you know a little about the Civil War, then you will most likely have heard of Sherman's March to the Sea. Before we do that, though, let's talk about Patreon content, and of course, we will be going back to the well of movie reviews, and we did one here that should be posted shortly. Alvarez Kelly's The Movie. William Holden stars, and it depicts the loose events of the beefsteak raid, which we talked about a couple weeks ago here in 1864 in the Petersburg area, Petersburg campaign. So we talk about the historical accuracy of that movie, kind of compare and contrast. If that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description to the Patreon, and there are other movie reviews, there are memoir reviews, as well as picture slideshows. And, of course, those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. When we last left off in Atlanta, William T. Sherman's army group had successfully captured the city. While the symbolic victory was there, the city really did not have too much in terms of strategic value. John Bell Hood was going to try to catch the attention of Sherman in the meantime by moving past him and into Alabama and Tennessee. Sherman's attention, as we will see, though, will not be so easily caught. George Thomas was going to be sent back into Tennessee to hopefully check any advance there, but Sherman's army in the meantime would remain in Atlanta. While he had sort of half-heartedly chased after John Bell Hood, we talked about these events a few weeks ago here, the Battle of Allatoona Pass, his eyes are going to be further afield. Marching his forces through Georgia would be something that he would seek approval from Grant for. In doing so, his men would forage off the land, destroy anything of military value, and in so doing undermine Lee's potential supply network and reroute more potential reinforcements that might be heading his way. There was much in terms of negative press for this venture, however. Many would wrongfully believe that Sherman might not be able to make it out of Georgia living off the land. Whether guerrillas or regular Confederate troops, they believed he might be ambushed, cut off, and annihilated. In reality, with Hood out of Georgia, the threat was extremely low. Guerrillas would not have been able to deal with his large command, and what was left of the Confederate forces likewise would not pose too much of a threat for veteran troops. William J. Hardee technically would have command of the department. Gustavus Smith's militia were still going to be around, and Joe Wheeler's cavalry, including William Red Jackson, would be available, but there would be really no more than 13,000 men to stop Sherman's much larger force. Sherman would divide his command into two wings, one under Oliver O. Howard, the Army of Tennessee, and the other the Army of Georgia under Henry Slocum. Howard would have the 15th Corps under Peter Osterhaus, and the 17th under Francis P. Blair. Osterhaus, though, of course, is going to be replaced at some point for Black Jack Logan. He's going to be coming back into the picture here, going home to actually campaign. Remember, it is election season, so he's not going to be initially with the Army. Osterhaus would have divisions under Charles C. Woods, William Babcock Hazen, John E. Smith, and John Corse. We have mentioned most of these men in the past, if you remember Corse recently from Allatoona. Blair has Joseph Mauer, relocated from A.J. Smith's command, Mortimer Leggett, and Giles Alexander Smith. Slocum will have the 14th Corps under Jefferson C. Davis and the 20th Corps under Alpheus Williams. Davis will have divisions under William P. Carlin. If you remember, he was frustrated by the lack of aggressive action at the Battle of Perryville in 1862, James D. Morgan, and Absalom Baird. Alpheus Williams will have divisions under Nathaniel Jackson, John White Geary, and William Thomas Ward. Nathaniel Jackson had served notably at Crantum's Gap in the Antietam campaign before falling from a horse prior to Chancellorsville and having to be sidelined. The cavalry, of course, would be under Judson Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick would only operate with some 2 brigades, which I think is another emphasis on the lack of strong defense that the Confederates can muster. If you were actually facing a large field army or a larger field army that would pose a threat, then you'd probably want more of a mounted contingent. You'd want them to be able to see what the enemy is doing, especially if you were open in the field, right? You're operating in the field, you could be hit in unfamiliar territory, right? In the instances of the Atlanta campaign, right? Joseph Johnston is always going to kind of be there. He's always going to be setting up defensively, so there's less emphasis on that. But if you are, stringing out your army without a reliable supply network, then yeah, you're going to be more vulnerable. You're probably going to want more cavalry to guard those supplied lines. Also going to want them to be actually looking out for the enemy as well. The 2 wings would set out, with one heading for Augusta and the other in the direction of Macon. Slocum would take the northern approach, and Howard with his wing on the southern route. Sherman would lay out the expectations of the march in his special orders. 4. The army will forage liberally on the country during the march. To this end, each brigade commander will organize a good and sufficient foraging party under the command of 1 or more discreet officers who will gather near the route traveled corn or forage of any kind, meat of any kind, vegetables, cornmeal, or whatever is needed by the command, aiming at all times to keep in the wagons at least 10 days' provisions for the command and 3 days' forage. Soldiers must not enter the dwellings of the inhabitants or commit any trespass, but during a halt or a camp, they may be permitted to gather turnips, apples, or other vegetables and to drive in the stock inside of their camp. To regular foraging parties must be entrusted the gathering of provisions and forage at any distance from the road traveled. 2 Army Corps commanders alone is entrusted the power to destroy mills, houses, cotton gins, and etc. And for this, general principle is laid down. In districts and neighborhoods where the army is unmolested, no destruction of such property should be permitted. But should guerrillas or bushwhackers molest our army, or should the inhabitants burn bridges, obstruct roads, or otherwise manifest local hostility, then army commanders should order and enforce a devastation more or less relentless, according to the measure of such hostility. As for horses, mules, wagons, the belongings of the inhabitants, the cavalry and artillery may appropriate freely and without limit, discriminating, however, between the rich, who are usually hostile, and the poor or industrious, usually neutral or friendly. Foraging parties may also take mules or horses to replace the jaded animals of their trains, or to serve as pack mules for the regiments or brigades. In all foraging of whatever kind, the parties engaged will refrain from abusive or threatening language, and may, where the officer in command thinks proper, give written certificates of the facts, but no receipts, and they will endeavor to leave with each family a reasonable portion for their maintenance. And lastly here, remember this is the language of 1864. This is Sherman talking in his orders. 7. Negroes who are able-bodied and can be of service to the several columns may be taken along, but each army commander will bear in mind that the question of supplies is a very important one, and his first duty is to see to them and those who bear arms. This is from William T. Sherman, Military Division of the Mississippi, Special Order 120, November 9th, 1864. Now, it is interesting to hear exactly in the orders. It might seem like a very orderly affair, right? And again, this kind of emphasizes the fact that the Confederates don't really have a major force in the area. So you might have been more disciplined with your troops had there been an army that you're going to have to fight relatively soon. But if there's no army A lot of these are going to be more lax. It seems very organized again in these orders, but if you're just sending out your foraging parties, it's going to become more and more liberal. And one of the things that Sherman is known for, and he's criticized for, and I think to a degree rightfully so, is that he kind of looks the other way when his men start going above and beyond. You have the point in here about if there's any kind of bushwhacking or guerrilla activity, then we're going to retaliate in kind. What exactly do you define as that, right? If there's constantly Confederate cavalry in the area and they're constantly harassing you, and you're going to see these foraging parties that are going to take, at times, harsh measures against the civilians, they're going to try to defend them, then you're going to have a good amount of activity around your army, and thus it's just going to be opening the door for interpretation and this retaliation. So there's going to be some harsher measures on this march. Now, it's not total war, right? There are certainly a good amount of individuals, and it is actually highlighted in the orders here, where if they are poor, or, obviously there are certainly a good amount of individuals at this point in the war who are kind of over it, right? To put it like that. They don't want to support the Confederacy any longer. They just want it to be over. Those individuals you can kind of skip over. But if you're having any kind of facility for war making, then you're going to have to destroy that. That's pretty well highlighted here in the orders. During the march, the troops would fan out and strip the country of resources. Leaving Atlanta would spark some smaller fires, but it was not on the scale you might have been led to believe. Sherman actually had set on his chief engineer, Orlando Poe, to set about destroying the infrastructure of Atlanta, anything that could be used in a war-making capacity. He does demolition work, I believe, on the train station there, as well as some other targets. And then there are subsequently some fires that get started. But at this point, really, anybody who was living in Atlanta has left. A lot of individuals who were in the countryside actually came into Atlanta. So there's kind of this shuffle of people, and the fires that start are not necessarily Sherman just burning Atlanta to the ground for no reason, right? But there are some fires that do get started. There would be very limited Confederate resistance, troops having to scramble to meet the threat posed by the large Northern Army. Confederates would start to try to build on reinforcements, but really would just have to route them to Savannah, especially any kind of additional troops from Florida and Carolina, although, once again, these resources were limited. Many formerly enslaved would see this as a true opportunity for freedom and join the column, or otherwise start their move further north. While the army was going to forage, as laid out in the orders, there would be bands of the formerly enslaved and those who were otherwise taking advantage of the situation who would loot the countryside. Unfortunately for dog people, many dogs were put to death by the Union troops. The dog was a form of protection, but they were also used in the control and capture, and sometimes death, of the enslaved. So they're a very important symbol, and important for the Southern Confederate civilians to still have control over the enslaved population, so a lot of them are put to death. There's several accounts of Union soldiers talking about how essentially all they're doing these days is just killing the dogs here in Georgia. One civilian would write about how there was a kind of formulaic way in which the Union troops would fire the country, make it so they could calculate how long it would take to get to them by the fires popping up en route. And here is the account from the Southern civilian. Slept in my clothes last night as I heard the Yankees went to neighbor Montgomery's on Thursday night at 1 o'clock, searched his house, drank his wine, took his money and valuables. As we were not disturbed, I walked after breakfast with Sadie, it's actually her daughter, up to Mr. Joe Perry's, my nearest neighbor, where the Yankees were yesterday. Saw Mrs. Perry in the road surrounded by her children, seeming to be looking for someone. She said she was looking for her husband. That old Mrs. Perry had just sent her word that the Yankees went to see James Perry's the night before, plundered his house, and drove off all of his stock, and that she must drive hers into the old fields. Before we were done talking, up came Joe and Jim Perry from their hiding place. Jim was very much excited. Happening to turn and look behind as we stood there, I saw some bluecoats coming down the hill. Jim immediately raised his gun, saying he would kill them anyhow. No, don't, I said, and ran home as fast as I could with Sadie. I could hear them cry, halt, halt, and their guns went off in quick succession. Oh God, the time of trial has come. A man passed on his way to Covington. I alluded to him, asking him if he did not know the Yankees were coming. No, are they? Yes, I said. They are not 300 yards from here. Sure enough, he said. Well, I'll not go. I don't want them to get my horse. And although within hearing of their guns, he would stop and look for them. Blissful ignorance. Not knowing, not hearing, he was not suffered the suspense, the fear that I have for the past 48 hours. I walked to the gate. There they came filing up. I hastened back to my frightened servants and told them that they had better hide, and then went back to the gate to claim protection and a guard. But like demons they rush in. My yards are full. To my smokehouse, my dairy, pantry, kitchen, and cellar, like famished wolves they come, breaking locks or whatever is in their way. The thousands of pounds of meat in my smokehouse is gone in a twinkling. My flour, my meat, my lard, butter, eggs, pickles of various kinds, and vinegar and brine. Wine, jars, and jugs are all gone. My 18 fat turkeys, my hens, chickens, and fowls, my young pigs are shot down in the yard, and hunted as if they were rebels themselves. Utterly powerless, I ran out and appealed to the guard. I cannot help you, madam. It is orders. Alas, little did I think while trying to save my house from plunder and fire that they were forcing my boys from home at the point of the bayonet. And in this instance, she's referring to the enslaved individuals of her household. One Newton jumped into bed in his cabin and declared himself sick. Another crawled under the floor. A lame boy he was. But they pulled him out, placed him on a horse, and drove him off. Poor Mid. The last I saw of him, a man had him going around the garden, looking, as I thought, for my sheep, as he was my shepherd. Jack came crying to me, the big tears coursing down his cheeks, saying they were making him go. I said, stay in my room, but a man followed in, cursing him and threatening to shoot him if he did not go, so poor Jack had to yield. Sherman himself and a greater portion of his army passed my house that day. All day, as the sad moments rolled on, were they passing, not only in front of my house, but from behind. They tore down my garden palings, made a road through my backyard and lot, driving their stock and riding through, tearing down my fences and desolating my home, wantonly doing it when there was no necessity for it. As night drew its sable curtains around us, the heavens from every point were lit up with flames from burning buildings. Dinnerless and supperless as we were, it was nothing in comparison with the fear of being driven out homeless to the dreary woods. Nothing to eat. I could give my guard no supper, so he left us. My heavenly Father alone saved me from the destructive fire. My carriage house had in it 8 bales of cotton, with my carriage, buggy, and harness. On top of the cotton were some carded cotton rolls, 100 pounds or more. These were thrown out of the blanket in which they were, and a large twist of the rolls taken and set on fire, and thrown into the boat of my carriage, which was close up to the cotton bales. Thank to my God, the cotton only burned over and then went out. Shall I ever forget the deliverance? The next day, about 10 o'clock, they had passed all but save one, who came in and wanted coffee made, which was done, and he too went on. A few minutes elapsed, and 2 couriers riding rapidly past. Then presently more soldiers came by, and this ended the passing of Sherman's army by my place, leaving me poorer by $30,000 than I was yesterday morning, and a much stronger rebel. So a couple of things here, right? It kind of seems, again, if you're going back to those original orders, there's not really a whole lot that's being carried out. There's a lot of looting that goes on. There are a lot of accounts that I've read of individuals who are hiding their valuables in their yard somewhere, or even in graveyards in some cases. And then you have the Union troops finding those valuables, money, whatever, taking that with them, right? Any kind of sustenance they're taking. And obviously, there's no kind of, again, in the orders, Sherman is not saying you leave a receipt, but certainly leave an account of that. Doesn't really seem to be any of that. Seems kind of indiscriminate here. And the other thing I do want to highlight as well is that, you know, there is this account of the enslaved individuals of the household being forced away. We saw some of that in Mississippi, right? Now, this is from the perspective of a slave-holding individual, right? So they are going to maybe have a skewed view of what the situation was on the ground, and maybe these individuals were actually willing to go. Maybe they're kind of spinning a light on it to a degree. But certainly there are accounts of those who didn't want to go with the army. And certainly either maybe freedom was certainly something that they wanted, but they didn't want to go with the army. There's always kind of the fear of being thrown into the Army. And in some cases, there was a little bit of an impressment going on in Mississippi, so it could be a very similar situation here. But that is at least something to ponder in this account, something that was included here that you can kind of question and kind of go back and forth. And certainly there's a lot of arguments for it being different than was portrayed. Maybe it was true, right, to a degree. So there's always kind of a column A, column B there. We can take some time now to discuss whether Sherman is conducting total war. The total war concept is often whispered about when his famous march to the coast and occupation of Savannah is mentioned. The dictionary would define total war as a war that is unrestricted of terms of the weapons used, the territory or combatants involved, or the objectives pursued, especially one in which the laws of war are disregarded. So in short answer, it is not in fact total war. Sherman was destroying the Confederate infrastructure, but it was not necessarily a war on its people. Civilians were not targeted for destruction as they were in, say, World War II. While it was not without the use of harsh measures, the burning of cotton fields, the stripping of the land of resources, it was also not disregarding the rules of war. Now, Sherman is going to blame the Southern leadership for the destruction, saying that they actually brought this onto themselves, with Georgia entering the war. While this might seem odd, we do need to point out that Sherman had embraced the South, having served as the head of a military school in Louisiana. Had there been more of an affinity to that community, it is likely in my mind that Sherman may have served for the South. Too many years in federal service and family ties to the North, with the Ewing family, though, had turned him to support the Union. Sherman is a kind of character, and I hope one day to maybe talk about him more in depth. Obviously, he's been on our story since 1861, right? You know, he's all the way back there, First Manassas. But really, it is sort of interesting. A lot of what you get with Sherman is after the war. It's post-war. He doesn't have a whole lot of friends after the war, oddly enough. You know, he had this kind of connection to the South. He liked the Southern people. He didn't like the fact that they had split from the Union. Obviously, he sees it as his duty to help rectify that, right, with his service for the Union Army. He has a very harsh measure here in Georgia that's not going to win him a lot of friends, right? And then, likewise, he's not going to get a lot of friends on the other side of the spectrum. Let's say, you know, the Republican side of the spectrum. You know, if you have your mostly Southern Democrats, your Republicans, who are those surrounding Lincoln and his administration, and maybe even more radical than Lincoln's administration, they're not going to like him either, because again, he is very much connected to the South. He has a certain view on black individuals that would not be PC today, right? He does not allow them to serve as combat troops in any capacity for his armies, and he has a very low opinion of them. And we will see, actually, there is some controversy that they will actually get into in early 2025 here, 1865, and that's going to stem from this march to the sea. But no, the answer overall is it's not total war. There's always usually a debate about that, and especially in many of the books that I've read, there's usually a section on that, but the short answer is no. As the columns would snake their way through Georgia and the countryside, the Confederate leadership would try to set up some kind of defense. Wheeler, Hardee, and Smith would be joined by Taylor and Macon. From there, they would determine that a response was going to be difficult. Smith's militia, under Pleasant J. Phillips, would shadow the southern wing of Sherman's army, and there would be instructions not to engage. Phillips, though, is going to disregard that, moving on the Federals at Griswoldville on November 22nd. It is here they would meet Walcutt's brigade in a series of assaults on artillery and Spencer-wielding troops. Federals would write about how great the slaughter was. Smith would be angered at the ill-advised attack by the intoxicated Phillips. Being inexperienced, they would form 3 compact lines, being torn up by the Union troops. 1,100 Georgians would become casualties, including many captured, compared to 94 Federals. The militia would then move on to join the defenders at Savannah. Remember, too, that these are militia, so they're not Confederate regular troops. There's a lot of accounts that I've read, specifically from Walcutt's brigade, that have talked about just how old or young the individuals are, how struck the Union troops are surveying the battlefield afterward at just how wide that age gap was between the two spectrums of the force, right? They're not facing normal Confederates here. And a lot of them are pointing to that, like, we knew that they were not normal Confederates because of how they assaulted us, and they kept trying to assault us. And they kept up a very brave attack, a very, very brave effort, but ultimately, at this stage in the war, it's not going to work. Slocum would occupy the state capital of Milledgeville on November 23rd. A mock session of the state legislature would be conducted by the federal officers before the building was looted. The only real resistance there was being gathered by Hal Cobb, who, to show the desperation of the Confederates, had recruited from convicts to put a force together. In fact, there are Union stragglers who are being pressed into service to actually fight for the Confederacy, or at the very least, provide labor for the Confederate forces. Famously, part of the defenders of Savannah are actually going to be cobbled together Union POWs or deserters or otherwise stragglers that have been picked up by Wheeler's cavalry. Kilpatrick would meanwhile be dispatched toward Macon. Now I think the usage of Kilpatrick would show just how nonchalant Sherman was about this move. Remember, removing the cavalry is depriving an army of its intelligence gathering capability. They would be skirmishing with Joe Wheel's cavalry as well as guerrillas. Kilpatrick would narrowly miss the prisoners that had been housed at Andersonville, but they would find the remnants of the POW camp, including some dead men left behind. Wheeler would catch up to Kilpatrick on the 26th, chasing the Federals out of their camp, and then almost catching Kill cavalry at Buckhead Creek before the 5th Ohio stopped the advance. December 4th would see the two cavalry sides engage once again at Waynesboro, Georgia, north of Slocum's column. Wheeler would throw up barricades, trying to block the way to Augusta. It had been surmised that this was perhaps the objective of Sherman's armies. Kilpatrick would charge the barricade and then another in the town of Waynesboro itself. Wheeler would deploy Texas and Tennessee cavalry to allow for his forces to escape. 190 Union troopers became casualties compared to 250 Confederates. As Sherman's men moved closer to Savannah, they would encounter some landmines. In a famous incident, Sherman would force Confederate prisoners to move forward and find any additional torpedoes. Savannah would be a potential rendezvous with the Navy, but really, to do that, Fort McAllister would have to be eliminated. Remember, we had talked about that work prior. Edward Hatch will be moving down from Hilton Head to join in a potential siege of Savannah. The city, though, had been surrounded by rice fields, which had been flooded to hinder any kind of potential Union assault. Narrow causeways were the only way to approach the city. On November 30th, Hatch's command would advance on Honey Hill, South Carolina, held by Smith's militia and artillery under Cuban revolutionary Ambrosio Jose Gonzalez. Hatch's command would attack, which included an assault by Alfred Hartwell's brigade. Hartwell participated in the war in Missouri during the Camp Jackson affair and will go on to serve in the Supreme Court of the Kingdom of Hawaii. In 1864, he would have a brigade of troops that would include the 54th Massachusetts. 755 Union soldiers would become casualties compared to only 54 Confederates, the rebels holding a strong defensive position. This is just a case in point example of why earthworks are so important and why they take such a precedent at the end of the war, right? You have this militia unit that had participated in what you would consider to be, an open conventional assault on Union troops, and they had been butchered as a result of that. But then you put them behind earthworks, and they actually do a really good job. With Sherman's army living off the land, connecting the Navy would be important for supply, should Savannah be put under siege. And this is another point of why it's so important that Hood decides to go into Tennessee. He doesn't actually get word that Sherman is actually moving through Georgia until he's essentially like in Alabama about to get into Tennessee. So it's really, there's nothing he can do. He's too far away at that point, right? And we'll talk about it when we get into Franklin and Nashville. But had there been some kind of troops in the field that Sherman had to deal with, had there been more defenders in Savannah, he's running out of supplies. It's one of those things that you kind of think is sort of a cakewalk, and because it does sort of end up being one in the end. But had there been more of a delay at Savannah, the Savannah defenses are pretty strong, albeit there's not really a whole lot of people there to hold them, right? But if Hood's army is in the vicinity, if there's capable troops there, and they are defending that city, then Sherman's going to have a real problem. He doesn't have supply lines back to Atlanta. He destroyed the infrastructure of Atlanta, right? Chattanooga is a long way away, right? You have Thomas and his troops who would probably still be in Tennessee. You know, maybe they would have been able to come up and shore up some supply lines. Sure, but in the immediate, Sherman would have to sit there outside of Savannah and come up with another plan, right? And that's one of the things that you also kind of look at as kind of a fringe point that you look at with Sherman, in that he's not really the best tactician. He's not really the best planner. The plan was to get to Savannah, and sure, he's lucky enough where Hood goes away. There's really not a whole lot of troops that are facing him, at least quality troops, right? Except really Joe Wheeler's cavalry. And if you're just going to be able to brush those away, then yeah, it's going to make you look like Napoleon. But it doesn't really take Napoleon to walk up to Savannah where there's a unit of troops that are actually, you know, Union prisoners who are defending it, and then say, all right, we'll assault here and we'll take the city, right? So there's a lot of fingers that get pointed at, a lot of criticism of Sherman, and you know, some of that's coming from the fact that he does conduct this march to the sea, and you know, he's pretty harsh on the civilian population. So you have to take some things with a grain of salt. But it is an interesting what if. You know, I'm always into the what ifs if you've listened to this podcast. But had Hood been in the vicinity, things would have been very different. So Fort McAllister would have to be taken. William Babcock Hazen, who was ever ready for action, would volunteer his 4,000 men to the task. On December 13th, he would launch an assault that would overwhelm the defenders with a cost of only 134 men. We have a first-hand account of a correspondent who witnessed the Battle of Fort McAllister. At Fort McAllister, today I have been a spectator of one of those glorious sights where the actors, passing through the most fearful ordeal of fire which befalls the soldier, come out successful and are always after heroes. The 2nd Division of the 15th Corps, having marched today 15 miles and without the assistance of artillery, have crossed an open space of yards under a fierce fire of 21 heavy guns, crawling through a thick abattis, crossed a ditch of great depth, at whose bottom were driven thick palisades, torn them away, surmounted the crests and palisades, shot and bayoneted the gunners who refused to surrender at their posts, and planted the stars and stripes upon the work in triumph. The assault was made with a single line, which approached the fort from all sides, but that of the river. At the same instant, never for an instant wavering, no man lurking shelter, but facing the fire manfully. The explosion of torpedoes at this point did not deter them. General Sherman's old division and corps had been told that he had said, carry the place by assault tonight, if possible. They resolved to fulfill their old commander's wish, and they did. Perhaps in the history of this war there has not been a more striking example of the evidence of quick, determined action. Had we waited, put up entrenchments, shelled the plain, and made the usual approaches, we should have lost many more lives, and time that was invaluable. As it is, our entire loss is not more than 19 men killed and wounded, and have gained, in necessity, a base of supply. Our whole army are eager to emulate such a glorious example, and thus esprit de corps has been raised to the grandest height. So we get some quite flowery language there. But the point is that Fort McAllister is the key to Savannah. It has been taken by Hazen's men. Sherman was then able to connect with the Navy and subsequent resupply. Hardee would wish to evacuate the city, which he would do so on December 20th. The Confederate forces being gone, the mayor would plead with John White Geary not to destroy the town. Sherman would advise to Geary to accept the terms. Union troops would occupy the city the following day. With Savannah in the hands of the North, the march to the sea was complete. Sherman himself estimated that the campaign had inflicted $100 million, which is equivalent to $982 million in 2023 currency in destruction, about one-fifth of which was actually valuable in terms of a military sense, while the remainder was simple waste and destruction. The Army wrecked 300 miles of railroad and numerous bridges and miles of telegraph lines. It seized 5,000 horses, 4,000 mules, and 13,000 head of cattle. It confiscated 9.5 million pounds of corn and 10.5 million pounds of fodder, and destroyed uncounted cotton gins and mills. Sherman, though, was not one to sit on his laurels. He would turn his attention toward continuing to destroy the last shreds of morale and hope for the South. He would turn his attention especially to the state that started it all, South Carolina. And so, with Sherman by the sea, we will call this episode to a close. The famous march is complete, but there would be further destruction for Sherman on the docket. Next week, we will turn our attention elsewhere. The Confederates would hatch a scheme to maybe turn some attention back to the north with a proposed burning of Manhattan, and we will look out west at the Sand Creek Massacre. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the Patreon, as well as website. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.